There are two writers that had great influence on me and on my life and on my thinking. One was the great Jewish scholar Abraham Heschel. And Abraham Heschel was this amazing man. In fact, during the Civil Rights Movement, he walked side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. Across the Selma Ridge, and in frequent protest he was there because his focus was on the prophets and the role that the prophets had in the life of ancient Israel. And what he wrote was that at the time of the monarchy, that what had begun to happen is that people in some ways had gotten lazy. They let the king do everything, and they trusted and believed in the king's policies and in the king's laws, because the king had told them that if you just let me take care of you, then you will be safe. And pretty soon what happened is the people not only just believed that, but the people gave away a lot of their freedom and a lot of their own wisdom and really, in a sense, a lot of their own intelligence. Because back in their memory, when they had become a people, back there at the time of Moses and Mount Sinai, that God had said to them, that you will be my people and I will be your God, and here's what life is going to be like. That is going to be lived in such a way that there are no distractions in your life. No distractions in the sense that you will be promised great things by other gods and you are to turn a deaf ear to those promises. That you will seek after the ways of prosperity and security by building more and more institutions of power, and you are to turn away from that, because I will be the one who will lead you and guide you. Because your freedom is found in me, and your freedom is not defined by your independence, but rather your freedom is always defined by the way that you shape your life according to my interest and my intent for the world. So that others will say, your purpose is to conquer nations. And I will say, you are a place of refuge where all the peoples of the earth will come to find comfort and find rest. The contrasts were sharp according to the way that the experience of Sinai set up. They had just come out of an experience of slavery where the Pharaoh defined their life by enslavement and oppression and harsh labor. And God brought them out of that place of slavery into a life of freedom. And I won't say just into a place of freedom, but into a way of life defined by there shall be no other gods except the God who liberated and set you free. You are not to misuse and misappropriate God's name for anything but peacemaking and compassion and justice. If you do, this is what will happen to you. And the vision of Sinai, and the vision of what Torah, not just as law, but the vision of a way of life lived in the world, was to be a powerful memory, but a memory not just of a past event, but a memory continually lived and experienced. In fact, our Jewish brothers and sisters just this past Friday began to celebrate that very event and memory, Passover. And a part of what Passover, as I understand it, being an outsider in a sense, is that when the youngest in the family says, well, what's the meaning of all this? What's the meaning of this way of life? What is it about this Torah that makes us different in the world? And the elder will say in the family, we were once slaves. We, meaning not they in the past, we today continue to be slaves when we do not embrace the way of God's life and God's vision, when we don't celebrate our freedom defined by God, rather than a freedom defined by amassing more and more wealth and more weapons of war, and somehow the false security of freedom that gives us really doesn't give us freedom. It enslaves and oppresses us in subtle ways and devious ways. So our Jewish brothers and sisters on Friday night and through this week till next Friday, remember they were once slaves. And as Abraham Heschel taught through the prophets, that what begins to happen at the time of the kings is that that sense of safety and security that comes by way of believing that what the King offers us is that safety and security, that it numbs us. It deafens our ears. Numbs us to the point that we begin to accept injustice as the norm rather than as an aberration. That we begin to tolerate, and just think about it, we begin to tolerate more and more violence because we are convinced by way of the King that that's just to be expected. And so where there might have been 30 deaths last year by gun violence, there are thousands of deaths now, and we just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, what can we do about it? That's how it is. And you see, what the prophets point out to us is that in our numbness, we are prone to be silent in the face of injustice. And when we are silent in the face of injustice, that we begin to participate in the very injustice by way of our silence. And that's what the King wants. The King doesn't want us to be critical thinkers. The King doesn't want us to be agents of justice and compassion and mercy. Because what do you do with those? What does it mean to heal the brokenhearted, to set free the oppressed, to open the eyes of the blind? Why should we care and worry about that? That's just how it is. What Abraham Heschel said is the prophet comes in and pushes our buttons and moves us, not in anger, but moves us with a sense of indignity at how people abuse and misuse those institutions of power for their own purposes. And who but us can hold them accountable? And who but us are responsible for our own silence and tolerance of injustice? We are responsible for creating the world in which we live. And the other writer that moved me was, of course, Walter Brueggemann, that you have heard me mention often. And Walter Brueggemann fine-tuned the message of Abraham Heschel to the point where what the prophet begins to do is not just to criticize the institutions of injustice and the abuses of power, but the prophet critiques it. And the difference is that when you criticize, you simply tear things down. When you critique something, you offer an alternative. And that's what the prophets do. The prophets invite us to consider an alternative. That's what Sinai and what Passover says. You are not intended, God never intended you to be slaves to another power. God intended you to be people with dignity, because you are made in the image and likeness of the divine, and all people are made in the image and likeness. You have dignity and integrity, which means that you match the words that you speak with the actions that you practice. And that's what the prophets do, offer an alternative. We don't have to accept injustice. It's not the norm. But what do? Well, we work for justice. We don't just provide charity, but we critique the institutions of power and injustice to such points that we call the question on them and will not allow ourselves to be silent or numb in the face of the injustice, but we begin to work for change. We begin to change the systems. We begin to change the way that people act and behave with reference to those systems. And here's what happens. And a part of what Jesus is saying to his disciples in the gospel is that, and even in the book of Revelation, that you see after a while the people go, well, we don't even know who God is. God's so far removed from us. And since we've suffered under this oppression for so long and have cried out so often, God doesn't seem to respond. So God must not care. And the prophets come and say, God's so passionately concerned about you that God even suffers with you in the midst of that. And God doesn't like it any more than you like it. And because God doesn't like it any more than you like it, God's going to do something about that. And Jesus comes into the world, the enfleshed embodiment of God. And what does he say about those institutions of injustice and the powers that abuse people? He says, I'm not tolerating them at all. And he goes and he touches lepers, breaking all those laws and rules set in place by the powers that be in the institutions that were established to continue to protect their privilege. Why should lepers have any privilege? They're diseased. Exclude them. Why should women think that they have any rights whatsoever? They're dirty and unclean most of their lives. Exclude them. And Jesus goes and associates with those so-called dirty and unclean women, and he lifts them up, and they become a part of his company. Unheard of that women could be true disciples. Unheard of. You see how he does it? He protests against the powers that have created the numbness and the silence in our lives because we've given away a vision of freedom and dignity and respect. And he does it not by revolution, but he does it by inviting transformation and change. The people of Jesus' day really did believe that when they died, they died. They were dead. There was nothing necessarily to come. And one final act of Jesus tells us that's not true. Stop believing the messages that you get that death is the end. And Easter morning, the tomb is shattered and broken asunder, such that the light of transformation and change, not only in Jesus' life, but the transformation and change that has occurred in everyone's life, or that can occur in everyone's life. Every time that Jesus touched a leper or associated with a woman, every time that Jesus sat with the poor, every time that Jesus invited a child to come and sit in his lap, they were changed and transformed. They knew that the norm was not true, and they knew that the false messages of the powers that be that keep promoting injustice and hate and violence are not true. Every time those people encountered Jesus, their lives were changed and transformed. And Easter, we saw that the disciples were yet to get it. They were locked behind closed doors in fear of the people. And that's where we are a lot of times, isn't it? Locked behind closed doors in fear for our lives. So we go and we buy more and more guns and put up more and more bars in our windows and hide more and more from interaction with other people, because we're convinced that everybody's out to get us and everybody's a threat to us. If they wear a hijab, if they look different, if they're a different skin color or a different sexuality, they're a threat to us. And so we pass laws and make more rules to keep people separate and apart. Easter broke that boundary line, opened us up, so that our lives are not reflective of fear that leads us to hate and be prejudiced, but our lives are led to what? What did we hear today? What does he say to us today? Love. Love everyone, even your enemy, for God's sake.
Your enemy.
Because in loving your enemy, I'd rather have someone who is alive than someone who's dead. Because if there are two of us alive, there's double the potential and opportunity for transformation in love in the world. Canon Trimble said this to the assembly of the Southwest Conference. We're a church of first. We're a church of first. You know that. The first to ordain an African American to full pastorate. The first to ordain a woman to full pastorate. The first to ordain an openly gay partnered man to full pastorate. We're people of first. And she said, maybe you've forgotten that. If we're a church of first, then you know what? Let's be the first church in Sun Lakes to say that everyone is welcome, regardless of their race, gender orientation, or ability. Oh wait, I think we did that. But does the rest of Sun Lakes know that? Have we just sat on it here? And if not, said it to anybody else? It might be the best kept secret of Sun Lakes. Why? Are we still convinced that because we proclaim that we're open and affirming and exclusive, that people will turn their backs on us and walk away? And so what if they do? Because we're a church of first. She also said, every community where there is a United Church of Christ should be a better community because we exist in their midst. Is Sun Lakes and South Chandler a better community because we exist? That I'm not sure about. Because I'm not sure that we've stepped outside of our walls yet. To be a community of healing, of hope, of making whole, of setting free, of lifting up. Oh, you all do a lot. But is it in the name of Sun Lakes Phase 1? Or Cottonwood? Or Ironwood? Or Oakwood? Or is it in the name of Sun Lakes United Church of Christ? There it is. Jesus says, I give you a new command, that you love one another, that you be an instrument of love, compassion, justice, making whole, setting free, lifting up, not for yourselves, but you become an agent for God in the world, that people will know that we understand this, and that we will not be silent, and will not be passive, and will not be fearful, because we have been changed and transformed by Jesus and his resurrection.